I'm Major Paula Hunt, an officer in the United States Army. I just got home after 72 straight hours of field training at Fort Liberty, and I found my husband, Blake, sitting behind my desk. He'd moved my Bronze Star and my challenge coins to make room for his spreadsheets. His voice was cold, rehearsed. Paula, I've spoken to a lawyer. I've calculated our marital assets. He slid a paper toward me, listing everything. This house, my grandmother's house, my military pension, even my father's cabin in Vermont. He looked me dead in the eye, his voice dripping with a sick sort of pride. This is my house now, Paula. Sign this 50-50 agreement, or get out. I looked at him, then at the document. He thought this was an ambush. He didn't know that as an intelligence officer, I never enter a room without knowing the exits. And he sure as hell didn't know I'd been preparing for this day for the last 18 months. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you've ever dedicated your life to something, only to have your own partner treat you like an ATM. The smell hit me first. Not the smell of a home, but the smell of an invasion. It was a sterile chemical scent of cheap cologne trying and failing to cover the faint aroma of stale coffee. I stood in the doorway of my own office, the grit and grime of the North Carolina woods still clinging to my uniform. For 3 days, I'd been living in mud and sweat, my body aching with a fatigue so deep it settled in my bones. And there he was, my husband, Blake. He wasn't in his usual sweatpants, lounging on the couch. He was wearing a crisp, dark Armani suit, the one I'd bought him for a military ball he complained about attending. He was sitting in my leather chair, behind my solid oak desk, the desk that had been my grandmother's. But it wasn't the bank statements or our mortgage papers, spread out across the polished wood like an enemy's battle plans, that made the blood freeze in my veins. It was my medals. My entire military life, 20 years of service, dedication, and sacrifice, had been unceremoniously shoved aside. He'd swept my Bronze Star, my meritorious service medals, and the heavy custom-minted challenge coins I'd earned from generals and command sergeants major. He'd just swept them into a messy pile like they were loose change from his pocket, all to make room for his sleek, silver laptop. And then I saw it, the final, unforgivable act of desecration. A wet ring of condensation was bleeding into the thick, cream-colored paper of my meritorious service medal citation, the ink of the commandant's signature starting to blur. He had used my honor as a coaster for his coffee mug. He hadn't even noticed. To him, it wasn't a symbol of a life's work. It was just a piece of paper in his way. In that instant, the physical exhaustion from the field vanished, replaced by an ice-cold clarity. The air in the room grew thick and still. This wasn't a discussion. This was an occupation. You need to understand, Paula, Blake began, his voice taking on the tone of a bad actor in a daytime soap opera. It was a voice he'd practiced, a performance designed to make him the hero of a story he hadn't written. I sacrificed my career to support you. I've been holding down the fort while you've been off around the world playing war games. I remained silent, letting his words hang in the air like poison. Holding down the fort. A slideshow of memories flickered through my mind, sharp and vivid. I remembered being on a crackling satellite phone call from a forward operating base in Afghanistan at 3 in the morning, my morning, to walk a plumber through fixing a burst pipe in our basement. I remembered arranging and paying for the lawn service from a sterile government apartment in Germany, because the neighbors had started to complain. Blake's fort was a fortress of self-indulgence. It consisted of 3-hour sessions at the gym, endless networking lunches that never produced a single dollar of revenue, and marathon sessions of Call of Duty in the finished basement I had paid for. He was a simulated soldier, playing out fantasies of heroism funded by the salary of a real one. His sacrifice was a fiction he told himself so often he'd started to believe it, and now he was trying to sell that fiction to me. He pushed a stapled document across the desk. At the top, in his lazy, arrogant scrawl, were the words, Marital Asset Declaration. His handwriting, just like his logic, was sloppy and entitled. It listed everything. This house, the one I was standing in, bought with the inheritance from my grandmother. a woman who spent World War II packing ammunition in a factory while her husband fought in the Pacific. The small rustic cabin in Vermont that my father, a Vietnam veteran, left to me and me alone in his will. And the final audacious demand, 50% of my future military pension. My sweat, my sword, the years away from home, the risks I'd taken, he'd reduced it all to a line item on a spreadsheet. The law is very clear, Paula. 50-50, he said, leaning back in my chair as if he were a king on a throne he'd just conquered. He wasn't just trying to take my money. He was trying to erase my history. He was attempting to sever the legacy of my family, to claim ownership of my 20 years of service, with nothing more than a cheap pen and an absolute deficit of shame. He wanted the spoils of a war he never fought. My eyes fell to the bottom of the last page, to the name of the law firm he'd retained. Thomas Garrett and Associates. Blake puffed out his chest, a smug grin spreading across his handsome face. I hired the best in the state, babe. A dry, humorless laugh almost escaped my lips. I knew exactly who Thomas Garrett was. In Fayetteville, North Carolina, you couldn't miss him. His face was plastered on every bus stop bench and every billboard along Bragg Boulevard, promising easy divorces and big settlements. An intelligence officer always does reconnaissance on the opposition. It had taken me all of 30 seconds on Google, months ago, to discover that Mr. Garrett had been suspended from the bar not once, but twice, for ethical violations. He was a bottom feeder, a caricature of a lawyer. I let my gaze travel from the document, up to Blake's triumphant face. My training kicked in, my heartbeat slowing to a steady, rhythmic drum. I kept my voice perfectly level, devoid of the fury that was coiling in my gut. Thomas Garrett, I asked, a hint of curiosity in my tone. Is that the guy who advertises on the shopping carts at the Food Lion? The smugness on Blake's face didn't just fade, it collapsed. It was replaced by a flicker of confusion, then a shadow of panic. The predator, so sure of his ambush, had just heard the distinct click of a trap springing shut beneath his own feet. He didn't realize it yet. He didn't realize that in his clumsy attempt to lay a minefield, he had handed me the map. He didn't realize I already knew his entire plan, long before he did. And as I looked at the man who was once my husband, I couldn't help but wonder, how did I ever let someone so weak, so utterly predictable, into my life in the first place? Why did his particular brand of cheap charm feel so familiar? Why did his cheap charm feel so familiar? Because I'd spent my entire life learning its language. It had the same face, the same easy politician's smile, and the same hollow core as my brother Ryan. Standing there in my violated office, the cold reality of my marriage didn't just dawn on me. It crashed over me like a tidal wave. I hadn't married a man. I had married a ghost from my past. I grew up in a small town in rural Georgia, the kind of place that had more churches than libraries and where the rhythm of life was dictated by the high school football schedule. Under the blinding glare of the Friday night lights, boys were kings, and girls were expected to be pretty accessories on the sidelines, smiling and silent. And in that kingdom, my older brother, Ryan, was the crown prince. He was the golden boy, the star quarterback with blonde hair, blue eyes, and a smile that could talk its way out of anything. To my father, a stern, quiet Vietnam vet, Ryan wasn't just a son. He was a second chance, a do-over of the youth war had stolen from him. But the shine on a golden boy can hide a lot of rust. Ryan was the one who wrapped my dad's Ford pickup truck around an old oak tree after a night of drinking with his buddies. He was the one who dropped out of college after a single semester, claiming the professors didn't get his vision. He was the one who burned through tens of thousands of dollars on 3 different surefire business ventures: a smoothie stand, a t-shirt printing company, and some vague import-export scheme. Each time he failed, my father, a man who rarely showed emotion, would just place a heavy hand on his shoulder. "That's all right, son," he'd say, his voice thick with unearned pride. "Failure is just part of the process." And then he would open his checkbook and pay off Ryan's debts, wiping the slate clean once again. And me? I was the invisible daughter, the ghost in the family portrait. I was the one who studied until my eyes burned, earning a full ROTC scholarship to college so my parents wouldn't have to pay a dime. I was the one who graduated with honors, my name called out on a stage my father didn't attend because Ryan had a really important softball tournament that day. I'll never forget the sting of his words when I told him I wanted to join the army. He just grunted from behind his newspaper. "That's no place for a woman," he said, not even looking at me. "Why can't you just stay here and find a good husband? Be more like your brother. Be more like the charming failure who couldn't hold down a job." That was the bar. I remember bringing home a report card with straight A's and 1 B+ in algebra. He'd scowled at the paper. "A B+? What happened here?" he demanded. 2 weeks later, he bailed Ryan out of jail for his third DUI without so much as a lecture. When I was promoted to captain, a milestone I'd worked tirelessly for, his first question wasn't, "Congratulations," but a casual aside to Ryan. "Hey, you think you might need to borrow some money from your sister for that new project of yours?" I spent my entire life trying to impress a man who was impossible to impress, because his eyes were always fixed on his flawed, golden son. The ugliest it ever got was Thanksgiving, 2018. It was the clearest, most painful demonstration of my place in the family. I had just returned from my second deployment to Iraq. I was 15 pounds lighter, hollowed out by the things I'd seen and done, carrying a weight on my soul that had nothing to do with my rucksack. The world felt fragile. I felt fragile. Ryan, of course, showed up 3 hours late to dinner, smelling of last night's bourbon. He breezed in, offered a charming, "Sorry I'm late, folks," and then dropped a bomb in the middle of my mother's carefully prepared feast. He announced with the casual air of someone discussing the weather that he had lost the $50,000 my father had invested in his latest venture, some cryptocurrency scam. The silence was deafening. My mother's face crumpled, and she started to cry softly into her napkin. The air crackled with tension. My father, his jaw tight, slowly pushed his chair back. He stood up, walked over to Ryan, and he hugged him. He pulled my failure of a brother into a tight embrace. "It's okay, son," he said, his voice gentle. "It's only money. We'll figure it out." Then he turned his gaze to me. I was just sitting there, frozen, trying to process the scene. He looked at me, not with sympathy, but with annoyance. "Paula, don't just sit there gawking," he ordered, his voice suddenly hard. "Get in the kitchen and fix your brother a plate of turkey. He looks exhausted." Exhausted. I, who had just spent a year in a war zone, was being told to serve the man who had just set fire to my father's life savings. In that moment, I understood. It didn't matter what I did. I could win a war single-handedly, and my father would still see me as less important than his son's fatigue. And then a few years later, I met Blake. He was charming. He was handsome. He said all the right things, whispering about how he admired my strength, my career, my discipline. He had Ryan's looks, but he seemed to worship the very qualities in me that my family ignored. He was the validation I'd been starving for my entire life. So I fell. Hard. Now, standing in my office, staring at that ugly brown coffee ring on my medal, the illusion shattered into a million pieces. The bitter truth settled in my gut like a stone. I hadn't married a strong man who saw my worth. I had married my brother's reflection. Another parasite who needed to be cared for. Another beautiful broken project I was expected to fix. I had escaped my father's house only to meticulously rebuild it, brick by toxic brick, with my own hands. I hadn't chosen a partner. I had chosen a pattern. If you've ever felt like the invisible one in your own family, if you know what it's like to be the responsible one while someone else gets all the grace, please support this story by hitting the like button and just type, "I see you," in the comments below. Let's show each other that we're not alone. That realization, that cold, hard truth, hurt more than his betrayal, because his betrayal was just an action. This was about a map of scars I'd been following my whole life, a map that had led me right back to this exact moment of ruin. But a map does more than show you where you've been. It can also show you a way out. A map can show you where you've been, but it can also show you a way out. 18 months ago, I decided to stop following the old, worn-out lines and draw a new one for myself. The decision wasn't made in a moment of anger, but in the quiet hum of tires on asphalt, somewhere on the lonely stretch of I-95 between North Carolina and Georgia. My father was having heart surgery, and I was making the 12-hour drive alone. Blake was supposed to be with me, holding my hand, sharing the driving. But at the last minute, a critical golf meeting had come up. A can't-miss opportunity with some potential investors he'd met at the gym. So, I packed my bag, filled up the gas tank, and drove south by myself, just like I always did. The miles blurred together under a gray, overcast sky. I felt a familiar ache settle deep in my chest. The exhaustion of being the only adult in the room, the only one who showed up. To fill the suffocating silence, I turned on a podcast. It was Brené Brown. Her warm Texas accent filled my car as she talked about the anatomy of trust. She said trust wasn't built in grand, heroic gestures. It was built in the small, mundane moments. The sliding door moments. It's remembering a birthday. It's asking, "How are you?" and actually waiting for the answer. It's choosing to believe your partner's best intentions. And it's never, ever, using their vulnerabilities against them. As she spoke, a cold, hard certainty crystallized in my mind. I didn't trust Blake, not in the small ways and certainly not in the big ones. I didn't trust him to manage a utility bill, let alone my heart. I realized I hadn't been loving him. I'd been managing him. I was his executive officer, his financial planner, his social secretary, and his mother, all rolled into one. I was constantly running interference, making excuses for him, covering for his inadequacies. I remembered once I'd bought him one of Brown's books, Daring Greatly. I found it a week later on his nightstand, being used as a coaster. He'd laughed when I mentioned it. "You don't need all that self-help crap, baby," he'd said, kissing my forehead. "You've got me." The irony was so thick it was suffocating. My kindness to him wasn't generosity. It was conflict avoidance, and it had to stop. The moment I got back to Fayetteville, before I even fully unpacked, I made an appointment. Not with a marriage counselor. There was nothing left to counsel. I made an appointment with Rachel Thornton. In the military community around Fort Liberty, Rachel was a legend. She was the lawyer colonels and generals put on speed dial when their 2-decade marriages finally imploded. Her name was spoken in hushed, reverent tones at the officers' club. She was sharp, expensive, and she did not lose. Her office was exactly what I expected, located on the top floor of a downtown high-rise with panoramic views of the city. It was clean, minimalist, and exuded a quiet, lethal competence. There were no family photos, no sentimental clutter. Just a solid mahogany desk and 2 leather chairs. I sat down across from her, a woman with piercing blue eyes and a perfectly tailored suit. I took a breath and laid out my mission objective. "I'm not looking to file for divorce today, Ms. Thornton," I said, my voice steady. "But I need to prepare for a future conflict. I need to protect everything my family passed down to me and everything I've bled for in my career." I expected questions, judgment, maybe even pity. Instead, Rachel just gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Major Hunt," she said, a hint of a smile on her lips. "Let's build a fortress." And for the next 6 months, that's exactly what we did. It was a covert operation conducted in total secrecy. Following Rachel's guidance, we established an irrevocable trust. It was a legal lockbox. I transferred the deed to my grandmother's house and my father's Vermont cabin into it. Legally, they were no longer mine to be divided. They were legacy assets, completely walled off from the definition of marital property. Blake even signed some of the transfer paperwork, believing it was just boring estate planning stuff he didn't need to understand. Next, we conducted a full financial audit. On the advice of the Judge Advocate General's office, the Army's own lawyers, I opened a new private bank account at Navy Federal. My military paycheck was rerouted there. I left our old joint account open, but I only deposited enough to cover the basic household expenses and what I privately called the Blake allowance. A predictable sum of money I knew he would waste on lunches, gadgets, and clothes. He never noticed. He was too busy spending my money to ever question where it came from. The flow of cash was steady enough that the frog never realized the water was slowly starting to boil. The hardest part wasn't the legal maneuvers. It was living a double life. On the surface, I was the dutiful, supportive wife. I smiled through the endless unit Christmas parties and battalion picnics. I patiently listened to his ridiculous business pitches. His latest was a plan to launch a veteran-owned brand of premium tequila, conveniently ignoring the fact that he'd never served a single day in uniform in his life. I would nod, offer vague encouragement like, "That sounds interesting, honey." And then, later that night, I would make a detailed entry in a private journal. Every lie, every broken promise, every dollar wasted. It was all logged, dated, and cataloged. I felt exhausted by the sheer effort of the deception. But underneath the fatigue, a different feeling was growing. A quiet, cold strength. I wasn't a victim waiting for the axe to fall anymore. I was an intelligence officer, gathering intel on a hostile target. I was mapping his patterns, his weaknesses, his ego. I was preparing the battlefield long before the first shot was ever fired. Because in my world, you learn a fundamental truth. Victory is never decided in the heat of the final battle. It's won in the long, lonely hours of preparation that come before it. And while Blake was planning his party, I was building my fortress, stone by silent stone. A fortress can be a lonely place. What I didn't realize then was that I was also, unknowingly, building a different kind of army. I had fortified my legal and financial positions, building walls of paper and law to protect my future. But I learned that the strongest walls aren't built by lawyers. They're built by loyalty. And that lesson came at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, 7 months before Blake's ambush. The call came from my mother. Her voice was thin and frayed, a sound I hadn't heard before. "Paula," she whispered, "he's gone." Just 2 words, but they shattered the quiet darkness of my kitchen. My father was dead. The phone slipped from my hand and clattered onto the tile floor. My own legs gave out from under me, and I crumpled, a silent scream caught in my throat. I was suddenly a child again, lost and terrified. The grief was a physical thing, a crushing weight that left me unable to breathe. From the bedroom, Blake emerged, squinting against the dim light from the hallway. He didn't rush to my side. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just stood there, annoyed, running a hand through his perfectly messy hair. "What the hell is all the noise?" he grumbled. Through a wave of ragged sobs, I managed to choke out the words. "My dad. He's gone." Blake didn't move. He just stared at me for a long moment, and then he sighed. It wasn't a sigh of sympathy. It was a sigh of profound, selfish irritation. "Damn it," he said, the words sharp and cold. "I just finalized that fishing trip to the Outer Banks this weekend with the guys. Now the whole thing is shot." He didn't hug me. He didn't offer a single word of comfort. He just turned around, muttering something about how he could never catch a break, and went back to bed. I heard the bedroom door click shut, plunging me back into darkness. I sat there on the cold floor, utterly alone, feeling a cold more profound than any winter night. The man I had promised my life to had just valued a fishing trip over my father's death. I don't know how long I sat there, wrapped in a silence that was louder than any scream. 30 minutes? An hour? The world had stopped turning. Then, through the fog of my grief, I heard a soft, hesitant knock on the front door. I stumbled to my feet, my body feeling heavy and disconnected. Peeking through the peephole, I saw Emma. My best friend. My battle buddy. We'd been through the grueling intelligence officer course together, learning to trust each other in ways civilians could never understand. She was standing on my porch in an old pair of flannel pajama pants and a faded Army PT shirt, her hair a mess. I opened the door, and she just looked at me with her kind, steady eyes. "Your sister called me," was all she said. No awkward questions, no empty platitudes. She just stepped inside, her presence a quiet anchor in my swirling chaos. She walked past me into the kitchen, filled the kettle with water, and put it on the stove to boil. Then she came back and simply sat down on the floor across from me, pulling her knees to her chest. She didn't speak. She didn't try to fix it. She was just there. Her silent, unwavering presence was the only thing that kept me from shattering into a million pieces. The next morning was a blur. I moved through the house like a ghost, mechanically trying to find a flight to Georgia, my mind numb. Blake had been on the phone since sunrise, loudly trying to reschedule his precious fishing trip, his voice echoing with frustration. Around 9, the doorbell rang again. It was Mrs. Chin, my elderly neighbor from across the street. She was a tiny, formidable woman, the widow of a command sergeant major who had fought at the Chosin Reservoir in Korea, one of the Marine Corps' most brutal and heroic battles. She stood on my porch holding a large steaming stock pot. The rich, savory aroma of chicken soup filled the air. "I heard about your father," she said, her Korean accent thick and her voice firm, like a commander giving an order. "You need to eat. Soldier cannot fight on an empty stomach." She pushed the heavy pot into my hands, her dark eyes looking straight into mine. It wasn't a look of pity, but one of fierce, protective love. It was the look of someone who understood loss, who understood duty. Behind me, in the living room, Blake was laughing into his phone, finally having secured a new date for his trip. The contrast was so jarring it made me physically sick. A week later, I returned from the funeral, my heart a hollow space in my chest. I walked into a house that felt different. It was clean, spotless. Emma had come over and done everything: the laundry, the dishes, even wiped down the countertops. On my front porch, there were 2 frozen casseroles in aluminum pans with a note taped to the top in Mrs. Chin's neat handwriting: "Heat at 350. Eat." And on my clean kitchen table, there was a small bouquet of white lilies and a card. It was from my lawyer, Rachel Thornton. It wasn't a generic sympathy card from a Hallmark store. It was a handwritten note on her professional letterhead. It said, "Paula, take your time. The fortress is secure. We have your 6." That's when I finally understood. Blake, my father, my brother. They might be my blood. But they were not my family. My family, my real family, was a retired soldier who knew the power of just showing up, a war widow who knew that soup was a weapon against despair, and a shark of a lawyer who understood that loyalty was the ultimate legal defense. They were my squad. With them guarding my flank, I felt ready for anything. I was prepared legally. I was supported emotionally. And right on cue, the enemy began his clumsy advance. My squad was in place. My fortress was secure. My emotional defenses were reinforced. And right on cue, the enemy began his clumsy advance. His intelligence operation, as I privately called it, began about a month before the ambush. And it was as subtle as a tank crashing through a garden party. His first move was a clumsy frontal assault on my family. My mother called me, her voice tight with a fury I knew all too well. She was a Georgia bulldog in human form, a tough Southern woman who had been a military wife for 30 years and could smell nonsense from a mile away. "Paola," she said, skipping the pleasantries, "your husband just called me." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Oh, what did Blake want? "He wanted to know about the deed to the Vermont cabin," she snapped. "He gave me some song and dance about wanting to surprise you. Said he wanted to modernize the property records for tax purposes." She let out a sharp, derisive laugh. "Tax purposes?" I told him if he was so concerned about taxes, he could take it up with the IRS. And then I told him to never, ever call me about my daughter's money again. She hung up. I didn't have to warn her. My mother had been watching men like Blake her entire life. She knew a parasite when she saw one. Strike one for the enemy. His next target was Emma. A few weeks later, I was on TDY, temporary duty, in Washington, D.C. for a series of briefings at the Pentagon. Emma was at my house, managing my schedule and correspondence from my home office. Blake, seizing the opportunity, decided to launch a charm offensive. He showed up at the office door with 2 coffees from Starbucks, a dazzling smile plastered on his face. "Emma, you're a lifesaver," he began, his voice dripping with synthetic sincerity. "I really want to take some of the load off Paula. She works way too hard." He leaned against the doorframe, trying to look casual and concerned. I was thinking, could I maybe take a look at the most recent financial statements? I just want to make sure everything's stable, you know? Get a handle on things for her. Emma, who was the co-architect of my entire defensive strategy, played her part beautifully. She gave him a sweet, accommodating smile. "Oh, Blake, that's so thoughtful of you," she cooed. "Of course. Let me print those out for you." She then handed him a neatly compiled report of the joint household account, the decoy. The one I intentionally kept funded just enough to pay the bills and his allowance. He took the papers, feeling victorious, completely unaware that he was studying a map of a fake country. Strike two. But his final move, the one that sealed his fate, wasn't just clumsy. It was arrogant. It was stupid. It was the act of a man so blinded by his own entitlement that he couldn't see the cliff edge right in front of him. I was reviewing my monthly statements online when I saw it. It was on my military Star Card account. Now, for those who don't know, the Star Card is a line of credit exclusively for service members and their families. You can only use it on military installations, at the PX for a new uniform, at the commissary for groceries, or at the on-base gas station. It's a part of the ecosystem of military life. My statement was always the same boring list: gas, groceries, a haircut at the base barber. But there, sandwiched between a $14.50 charge for a coffee at the Green Beans and a $70 grocery run, was one glaring, impossible charge. A single payment of $5,000 made out to Garrett and Associates. He had paid the retainer for his divorce lawyer with my military credit card. He had taken a tool, a privilege, earned through my own service and sacrifice, and turned it into the very weapon he intended to use against me. The audacity of it was breathtaking. It was more than theft. It was a profound act of disrespect, a contamination of my professional world with his personal greed. I picked up my phone and called Rachel Thornton. I explained the charge, my voice a flat monotone. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, and then Rachel burst out laughing. It wasn't a small chuckle. It was a deep, unrestrained, victorious laugh. "Oh, Paola," she finally said, catching her breath. "This isn't a legal battle anymore. This is a public execution. He just handed us a signed confession of felony fraud. The man is a walking, talking gift to our case. Strike three." He was out. The absolute peak of his arrogance came the night before the ambush, the night before he planned to detonate our lives. He drove us to a fancy steakhouse in Raleigh, a place with white tablecloths and waiters in black vests. He ordered an expensive bottle of Cabernet and raised his glass. "To you, Major Hunt," he said, his eyes shining with a sincerity that made my skin crawl. "To all your success." I knew from a forwarded email Emma had intercepted that he'd spent 2 hours that very afternoon in a strategy session with Thomas Garrett. He wasn't toasting my success. He was toasting his impending payday. He was celebrating the successful conclusion of his plot to stab me in the back, and he was doing it on my dime. I looked at him over the rim of my wine glass, this handsome, hollow man who had no idea he was already a ghost. I smiled my most supportive wife smile and clinked my glass against his. "Thank you, Blake," I said, my voice smooth as silk. "It's so good to know you're always in my corner." He had no idea I wasn't just lying. I was confirming my final piece of intelligence before the main engagement. The battle he thought he was starting tomorrow, I was about to finish it. The steak dinner was the overture. That night, back at the house, the final act began. The air in my own home felt foreign, thick with a tension so palpable I could taste it. It was the same day as the ambush in my office, but the atmosphere had shifted from a surprise attack to a drawn-out siege. Blake had tried to set a stage. He'd lit a few candles, their flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. But no amount of candlelight could mask the greasy, cloying smell of cheap Chinese takeout. I walked into the dining room, and my breath caught in my throat. He was serving dinner. Little white cardboard boxes and plastic containers from Panda Express were sitting open on the table, globs of sticky orange chicken, beef and broccoli, and a styrofoam cup of hot and sour soup. And he was serving it on my grandmother's Lenox holiday china. The fine porcelain plates, rimmed with holly and ivy, that we only ever used for Thanksgiving and Christmas. Plates that had held the weight of family tradition for 3 generations were now being desecrated with fried rice and chow mein. He was ladling a history of disrespect onto a family heirloom. It was a declaration of war. "Have a seat," he said, his voice laced with a false, magnanimous tone, as if he were a king granting me an audience. I sat, my movements stiff and controlled. My body was a coiled spring. He launched into his rehearsed speech, a near-perfect echo of the performance he'd given that morning. He spoke of how my military career had created a distance between us. He lamented how he had been forced to carry the emotional burden of our marriage while I was deployed. He talked and talked, weaving a careful narrative that painted him as the martyred husband, the unsung hero, the victim of my ambition. I let him speak. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. I just watched him, my gaze steady and unwavering. My training as an intelligence officer had taught me the immense power of listening. You let the target talk, and eventually they will give you everything you need. My phone, tucked into the pocket of my jacket, was recording every single word. North Carolina is a one-party consent state. I just needed one final, undeniable piece of evidence. I needed his confession on tape. Finally, the monologue wound down. He slid the fraudulent separation agreement across the table, the document I had mentally labeled his terms of surrender. He had added a few new, even more ridiculous demands since that morning. He wanted the house, 50% of my pension, alimony, and a new clause demanding all family military heirlooms, as if the medals my grandfather had earned were now his to claim. I stared at the papers, my face a blank mask. I didn't react. My lack of immediate compliance seemed to shatter his composure. The calm, calculated facade cracked, revealing the ugly, entitled rage beneath. He slammed his fist on the dining room table. The Lennox china jumped with a sickening clatter. "Listen to me, Paula," he roared, his voice raw and shaking. "I've been more than generous. You either sign the damn papers or you get the hell out. This is my house now." And there it was, the kill shot, the confession. A direct, unequivocal threat and an explicit statement of his intent to seize property that was not his. All of it beautifully captured in high-fidelity audio. The trap was sprung. I lifted my eyes from the document and met his gaze. There was no fear in me, only a cold, crystalline resolve. I let a slow, sad smile touch my lips. "You're right, Blake," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You've been more than generous." Victory flashed in his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, a triumphant smirk spreading across his face. He thought he'd won. He thought my quiet words were the sound of surrender. I reached for the pen lying next to the papers. My hand was perfectly steady. Slowly, deliberately, I initialed the bottom of each page. Then, on the final page, I signed my full name with a crisp, decisive flourish. I capped the pen and placed it neatly back on the table. Then, I reached for my left hand and slid my wedding ring off my finger. It felt strangely light. I placed the simple gold band and the heavy, old-fashioned house keys on the table, right next to a half-eaten carton of orange chicken. The clink of the metal on the porcelain was the only sound in the room. "The house is yours," I said, my voice calm and clear. "If you believe that sometimes the strongest move is the one nobody sees coming, hit that like button. And if you've ever had to walk away to save yourself, comment with a single word. Freedom." Without another word, I stood up. My pre-packed duffel bag was waiting by the door. I picked it up, swung it over my shoulder, and walked out of my grandmother's house. I didn't look back. I left him there, frozen in his chair, a look of stunned, idiotic triumph on his face, surrounded by the ruins of a victory he hadn't actually won. He thought he was watching me retreat. He had no idea he was witnessing the launch of a full-scale counteroffensive. I didn't drive to Emma's house for comfort. I didn't drive to a friend's for a shoulder to cry on. Grief and shock were luxuries I couldn't afford. I drove to my pre-designated Tactical Operations Center, a clean, anonymous room at the Marriott on Skibo Road, booked a week in advance under my maiden name. This wasn't a retreat. It was a forward operating base. I walked in, dropped my duffel bag on the floor, and didn't even glance at the king-sized bed. My objective was the simple desk in the corner. I flipped open my laptop, the screen glowing in the dim room. My fingers flew across the keyboard. A pre-drafted email was pulled up. I attached the audio file from my phone, the recording of Blake's final, fatal ultimatum. The subject line was simple, a phrase every soldier understands. In all caps, I typed, "Go." I say again, "Go." I hit send. The message was on its way to Rachel Thornton. The second the email was sent, I picked up my phone. My first call was not to my mother or my sister. It was to my personal financial advisor at Navy Federal Credit Union, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Susan I'd worked with for years. She answered on the second ring. "Susan, it's Major Hunt," I said, my voice calm and devoid of emotion. "It's time. Engage Operation Meltdown." There was no hesitation on her end. "Acknowledged, Major. Engaging now." The fortress was built. The enemy was inside. It was time to cut the supply lines. And in the next 15 minutes, Blake's entire world began to systematically evaporate. It happened with a series of quiet, efficient keystrokes from people who had been waiting for my command. First, Susan terminated his access to all joint bank accounts, leaving him with nothing but the few $100s in his personal checking account. Next, the supplementary American Express Platinum card in his name. The card that funded his leased BMW, his ridiculously expensive gym membership, his golf trips, his entire fabricated life, was instantly deactivated. He was no longer a card holder. He was a liability. Simultaneously, I logged into my military Star Card account and reported the card as compromised due to fraudulent activity. The account was frozen within 60 seconds. The final and perhaps most satisfying step was an email I sent to the Legal Assistance Office at Fort Liberty, CCing my commander. I formally requested the suspension of Blake's dependent ID card pending a legal review of his conduct, citing financial fraud and potential conduct unbecoming of a military spouse. His access to the base, the gates, the PX, the commissary, the very community he pretended to be a part of, was now flagged. He was, for all intents and purposes, an outsider. The oxygen was being cut off. While the systematic demolition of his life was underway, Blake himself was celebrating his glorious victory. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. It was a screenshot from Instagram. There he was, in my living room, feet propped up on my grandmother's cherry wood coffee table. He was holding up a bottle of beer in a triumphant toast to the camera. The caption beneath the photo was a masterclass in narcissistic delusion. Finally cleared out some negative energy tonight. Onwards and upwards. New life? Holding down the fort. Good vibes only. He was bragging on a public forum about stealing my home and kicking me out. He was using hashtags that mocked the very lies he used to tell me. He was arrogant, he was brazen, and he was, without a doubt, the stupidest man I'd ever met. I forwarded the screenshot to Rachel. Her reply came back in seconds. "Exhibit A for intent," the text read. "The man is a fool. This is beautiful." The fallout from Operation Meltdown didn't take long. It was faster and more spectacular than I could have hoped. About an hour later, my phone rang. It was Susan from Navy Federal. I could hear her trying and failing to suppress a laugh. "Major Hunt," she said, her voice shaking with amusement. "Just wanted to give you a situational update. It seems Mr. Blake attempted to pay a $400 bar tab at a sports bar downtown." "And?" I asked, my voice flat. "And his American Express was declined. Then he tried the joint Navy Federal debit card. Also declined. For his grand finale, it looks like he tried to use the military Star Card." She paused for dramatic effect. "Also, unsurprisingly, declined. I believe the celebration may be officially over." I pictured it. The grand gesture surrounded by his buddies. The confident swagger as he handed over the card. The bartender's polite but firm rejection. The flush of confusion on Blake's face, turning to red-hot anger, then to cold, public humiliation as he fumbled through his wallet, pulling out card after useless card. He, who had just declared himself king of my castle, couldn't even buy a round of drinks. I didn't smile. I didn't laugh. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury." My revenge wouldn't be emotional or chaotic. It would be precise, legal, and absolute. I simply nodded to myself in the quiet hotel room. "Thank you for the update, Susan," I said. First target neutralized. I thought watching his financial world crumble was the ultimate victory. I thought the public humiliation of a declined credit card was the worst I could inflict. I was wrong. The intelligence Emma was about to deliver would turn this strategic demolition into a personal annihilation. The next morning, annihilation arrived. It didn't come in an email or a phone call. It came in the form of my best friend, standing at my hotel room door with a face as pale as a ghost. Emma looked like she hadn't slept, her eyes wide with a mixture of guilt and dread. "Paola, I have to tell you something," she stammered, her voice trembling. She stepped inside, unable to meet my eyes. I saw Blake, a few months ago. You were out at Fort Huachuca for that advanced NCO course. He was here, at this Marriott, actually, with another woman." She finally looked at me, her face pleading for forgiveness. "I didn't tell you because you were prepping for your big evaluation. I didn't want to derail you. I hoped it was a one-time thing, a stupid mistake." "I'm so sorry, Paula. I should have said something." The cold, controlled anger I'd been nursing for the past 12 hours began to melt, replaced by a dull, familiar ache. Of course, he was cheating. It was the last piece of the pathetic puzzle. I reached out and put my hand on her arm. "Emma, you did nothing wrong," I said, my own voice surprisingly steady. "You were protecting your friend, that's all. Did you know who she was?" Emma nodded, her relief visible. She pulled out her phone, her fingers shaking slightly as she tapped the screen. "Her name is Jessica Reeves," she said, her voice filled with disgust. "She's a personal trainer." She handed me the phone. Jessica's Instagram profile was public. It was a predictable collage of gym selfies in brightly colored spandex, bikini photos on a beach, and inspirational quotes about hustle and good vibes. I scrolled through the images, my stomach churning. And then I stopped. My finger froze on the screen. It was a photo of her and a friend laughing at some trendy downtown restaurant. My thumb moved to zoom in, my heart pounding against my ribs. There, around her tanned, smiling neck, was my grandmother's sapphire pendant, the delicate antique necklace with the deep blue stone that I had searched the entire house for, turning over every drawer, convinced I had lost it. Blake had helped me look, his face a mask of concern, telling me it must have disappeared during one of our moves. He had lied. He had stolen it from me. A wave of nausea washed over me. I kept scrolling, a sense of dread coiling in my gut. Another photo. A selfie of her in a convertible, hair blowing in the wind, one hand on the steering wheel. And on her wrist. Oh my God! On her wrist was my grandfather's watch. His vintage 1940s Hamilton field watch, the one he wore when he stormed the beaches of Normandy on D-Day. The watch my father, his hands trembling with Parkinson's, had placed in my palm just before he died. He would have wanted his toughest soldier to have this, my dad had whispered. Blake had stolen a piece of my father's soul and given it to his mistress as a trinket. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the phone. And then, as if on cue, my own phone began to ring. The caller ID read Mrs. Chin. I answered, my voice a strangled whisper. "Mrs. Chin?" "Major," she said, her tone sharp and urgent. "I think you need to see this." A second later, a video file appeared in my text messages. I clicked on it. It was footage from her front door security camera, time-stamped the previous week, while I was in D.C. The video was clear as day. A late-model white Mustang, Jessica Reeves's car from her Instagram photos, was parked in my driveway. The footage showed Blake and Jessica walking in and out of my house, laughing, holding hands. At one point, Blake came out carrying one of my mother's antique jewelry boxes, and he placed it in the trunk of Jessica's car. The rage that exploded inside me was pure white heat. It burned away the shock, the grief, everything. He hadn't just cheated on me in my bed. He hadn't just lied to me. He had brought his mistress into my home, my grandmother's home, and together they had picked through the sacred relics of my family like vultures scavenging a corpse. He had conspired with her to steal my history, piece by precious piece. Within an hour, the full intelligence picture was assembled. Blake wasn't just a lazy, narcissistic leech. He was a philanderer. He was a thief. This wasn't a spontaneous act of greed. It was a long-term, calculated campaign of betrayal. He had been systematically looting my life and my legacy to finance and impress his affair, all while simultaneously plotting to legally steal everything that remained. The anger inside me cooled, hardening from a raging fire into a solid block of ice. This was no longer a divorce, it was a pest extermination. I picked up the phone and dialed Rachel Thornton. "Rachel, it's Paola," I said. "It's worse." I told her everything. The affair, the stolen jewelry, the watch, the security footage. I emailed her the Instagram photos and the video file from Mrs. Chin. I didn't cry. My voice was as cold and flat as a steel plate. When I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Rachel spoke, and her voice was no longer the voice of a lawyer. It was the voice of an executioner. "Send me everything," she commanded, her tone like flint striking steel. "Every photo, every video, every text. It's over, Paola. The game is over." She was right. This was no longer about winning a divorce. This was about justice. Swift, total, and uncompromising. And I knew exactly how it would be delivered. The game ended less than an hour later with a single phone call. Rachel dialed Thomas Garrett's office from her sleek mahogany desk, and she put him on speakerphone for me to hear. I sat in one of her leather chairs, my back straight, my hands resting calmly in my lap. The wait was short. "Tom Garrett," a smug, gravelly voice answered. "Tom, it's Rachel Thornton," she said, her voice as cool and smooth as polished granite. "I'm reviewing the separation agreement you sent over on behalf of Mr. Blake. I see you've listed the property on Hay Street as a primary marital asset." I could practically hear the smirk in Garrett's voice. "That's right, Rachel. My client has established residency. The law is quite clear." Rachel cut him off, her tone shifting from cool to ice cold. "Then I assume you're also aware, Tom, that the property in question was placed into an irrevocable trust 18 months ago?" Dead silence. The smugness evaporated, replaced by a thick, heavy pause. I could hear the faint sound of papers shuffling frantically on the other end of the line. A trust?" Garrett stammered, his voice suddenly an octave higher. "What kind of trust?" "The legally ironclad kind," Rachel replied, pressing her advantage. "And are you aware that your client, Mr. Blake, signed the notarized documents acknowledging the existence and terms of that trust? His signature is right here, next to my client's." The shuffling stopped. Garrett was cornered. "Now, Rachel, hold on," he sputtered, trying to regain his footing. "There may have been some misunderstanding with my client." "Oh, there's no misunderstanding, Tom," Rachel said, delivering the final, devastating blow. "I also have a crystal-clear audio recording from last night, a recording where your client explicitly states, and I quote, 'This is my house now,' before coercing my client into signing a fraudulent document that you both knew was based on a false premise. Do you have any idea what you've done, Tom? You've made yourself an active participant in felony fraud." A muffled sound came through the speaker, and then Garrett's voice, no longer directed at Rachel, but screamed in panicked fury at someone else in his office. "Blake, you idiot! You told me she agreed to it." He had forgotten to mute the phone. We could hear every panicked, incriminating word. "You absolute moron! She was recording you! You committed fraud, Blake! You handed her the evidence to bury you." The rest of the call was short. Rachel laid out the terms of surrender. Not a negotiation. An unconditional surrender. Blake had 24 hours to remove his personal belongings from my property. If a single item of mine was missing, or if he was not completely gone by noon the next day, she would forward the audio recording, the Instagram posts, the security camera footage of the theft, and the fraudulent credit card charge to the Fayetteville Chief of Police, the Cumberland County District Attorney, and my commanding officer at Fort Liberty. He had no choice. The king had been toppled. The game was over. To ensure a smooth transition of power, I called in an appropriate supervisor, my brother-in-law, David. David is a Marine gunnery sergeant, stands 6'3", has a shaved head, and a neck as thick as a tree trunk. He doesn't say much, but he doesn't need to. His very presence is a statement. He agreed to oversee Blake's departure. The next morning, I parked my car down the street, watching from a safe distance. Blake's brother arrived in a battered, rust-colored Ford F-150, a cloud of exhaust smoke sputtering from its tailpipe. David's immaculate black Ram 1500 was parked in my driveway like a silent, imposing sentinel. I watched as Blake, his face pale and slack with shock, began his walk of shame. He was no longer the conquering hero. He was a defeated man, reduced to carrying boxes of his own junk. Even in his final moments of delusion, the arrogance flickered. David later told me that Blake had tried to unhook the 80-inch flat-screen TV from the living room wall. "I paid for that," Blake had insisted, his voice trembling. David didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and held it up for Blake to see. It was a copy of my military star card statement, with the purchase of the television from the Fort Liberty PX, and my name highlighted in yellow. Blake said nothing more after that. In the end, everything Blake truly owned fit in the bed of that rusty pickup truck. There was his collection of designer clothes, all bought with my Amex card, his set of golf clubs, a birthday gift from me, a few boxes of video games, and other miscellaneous junk. It was a pathetic inventory for a man who, just 24 hours earlier, believed he was entitled to half of my life's work. Across the street, Mrs. Chin stood on her perfectly manicured lawn, her arms crossed over her chest, observing the entire pathetic spectacle. She looked like a general reviewing a defeated army. As the F-150, loaded down with the sad remnants of Blake's life, finally sputtered down the street and rounded the corner, she caught my eye from across the way. She gave me a single, sharp nod of approval. He came into my life with nothing. He tried to leave with everything, and in the end, he left with nothing, just as he had arrived. The battle was over. The enemy was gone. And for the first time in a very long time, my home was silent. Now, the real work could begin. Reclaiming it. The reclaiming began the next day. I called it Operation Clean Sweep. It wasn't about anger anymore. It was about purification. I hired a deep cleaning service, a team of professionals who descended on the house with industrial-strength supplies. I gave them one simple instruction. I wanted no trace of him left. I wanted his scent, his energy, his very memory, scrubbed from the floorboards. While they worked, I did my own clearing. The king-sized mattress from our bedroom, the one that had held so many lies, was dragged out to the curb with a sign that said, "Free." Any clothes or belongings he'd abandoned in his hasty retreat were boxed up and driven straight to the Goodwill Donation Center. I didn't want to see them, touch them, or think about them ever again. My most important act was throwing open every single curtain and blind in the house. I let the bright, unforgiving North Carolina sunlight flood into every corner, chasing out the shadows. That evening, after the cleaners had gone, I walked through the house with a bundle of burning sage, the gray aromatic smoke curling into every room. It might seem silly to some, but for me, it was a necessary ritual. I wasn't just cleansing a physical space, I was cleansing a timeline. I was reclaiming my past and clearing the way for my future. As the last wisp of smoke dissipated, my doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Chin, holding a plate covered in plastic wrap. It wasn't another pot of chicken soup. It was a brightly colored mound of her homemade kimchi. It was spicy, pungent, and vibrant with life. She pushed it into my hands. "Now," she said with a firm nod, a small smile playing on her lips, "now, it is your house again." The next day, I drove to the climate-controlled storage unit where I'd kept the most important pieces of my history, safe. I brought my family's legacy home. Back in my office, I carefully unpacked the boxes. I took out my meritorious service medal citation, the one Blake had used as a coaster. With a soft, damp cloth, I gently dabbed at the faint, brown ring until the last trace of his disrespect was gone. Then, I hung it back on the wall, in its rightful place. Next to it, I hung my bronze star. And next to that, I mounted the shadow box containing my grandfather's World War II medals, his Purple Heart, and his Victory Medal. Finally, I took out the perfectly folded American flag that had been draped over my father's coffin, its colors still deep and rich. I placed it on the highest shelf of my bookcase, a place of honor. This wasn't a wall of ego. This was a wall of sacrifice, a testament to a family line of service, of duty, of honor. This was what Blake had tried to steal. This was what I had fought to protect. This was the foundation of my fortress. That night, for the first time, I sat alone in my office and felt no need to fill the quiet. The silence in the house was immense. Before, that same silence had always been a warning. It meant Blake was sulking, or hiding something, or plotting. It was a silence filled with tension, a prelude to a storm. But now it was just peace. It was the sound of my own breathing, the hum of the refrigerator, the gentle rustle of leaves outside my window. It was the sound of safety. My grandmother used to quote the Bible to me when I was a girl. Her favorite verse was from the Gospel of John. "And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." I never fully understood the depth of those words until that moment. The truth she spoke of wasn't just some grand spiritual concept. It was the cold, hard, verifiable truth of bank statements, the legally binding truth of trust documents, the undeniable truth of a secret audio recording. The truth wasn't an idea. It was evidence, and that raw, unvarnished truth was what had finally, truly, set me free. A month later, what was left of Blake's world had completely imploded. I heard through the grapevine that Jessica Reeves had seen the Instagram comments flooding his celebratory post, discovered the truth about his financial situation, and had very publicly blocked him on all social media. With no money and no prospects, he had been forced to move back home, into the basement of his mother's house. I decided it was time for a celebration of my own. Not a loud, boisterous party, but a quiet dinner to honor my real family. My guests were a small, formidable group: Rachel, Emma, Mrs. Chin, and my younger sister, who had driven up from Georgia. There was no cheap beer. Instead, we opened a bottle of the best Cabernet Sauvignon I could find. We sat around my dining room table, the Lenox china gleaming under the warm light. This time, it held a meal cooked with love. At the end of the night, Rachel raised her glass. Her eyes, usually so sharp and analytical, were soft. "To Major Paula Hunt," she said, her voice clear and strong, "who has proven that the greatest victory is not in the destruction of the enemy. It is in holding your own ground so firmly, so intelligently, that you force them to destroy themselves with their own flawed tactics. To the fortress." To the fortress. We all echoed, our glasses clinking together. I looked at the faces of these incredible women, my squad, my true family. They were the architects of my freedom. And in that moment, sitting in my grandmother's house, surrounded by my chosen family, I knew my future would not be defined by what I had torn down, but by the beautiful, strong, and peaceful life I was now free to build. Thank you for following my journey to this new dawn. My war is over, but I know many of you might be in the middle of your own battles. If I've learned anything, it's that your value is never determined by those who try to diminish you, and your real squad, your real family, are the ones who show up when the world walks out. If you believe in the power of truth and resilience, please consider this channel your own fortress. Hit that like button to show your support and subscribe to become part of our community. Share this story with anyone who needs to hear that they have the strength to reclaim their peace. You are not alone.